Okay, this lecture is about the end of the 1930s and the 1940s, focusing in particular on civil rights activism and black labor activism in World War II. I'm going to make my main argument is that I'm going to sort of continue what I started in my lecture about the Great Depression when I said that the black political and economic struggle forms, according to historians, a part of the long civil rights movement. So I also want to make a more specific point today, though. In the 1930s and 1940s, we see the absolute centrality of black labor activism to the civil rights movement in a way that we've never seen before and we haven't seen since. The Communist Party, labor leader A. Philip Randolph, the Union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids, and the March on Washington movement of the late 1930s and early 40s sits at the center of black labor and civil rights history in this period. So note that during World War II, we also have the WWII campaign, as well as the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaign. I'm not going to focus on these campaigns today, but you do need to know them, so make sure to review that section of the reading that was due by Joe Trotter. So before delving into black labor activism in World War II, I want to talk about another really defining moment for civil rights during the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s. Another reason why African Americans increasingly are flocking to the Democratic Party. And that's the Marian Anderson Easter Sunday concert of 1939 at the Lincoln Memorial. Marian Anderson was an African American woman. She was one of the greatest opera singers of the 1930s. She was born in the United States, but becomes a superstar in Europe because she's unable to establish her career in the U.S. So given her fame, Howard University in Washington, D.C., an historically black college, invited Marian Anderson to sing in the U.S. a few times in the mid to late 1930s. So as she becomes more and more famous, and as her fees go up, Howard University needs to look for a bigger venue for her concerts. In 1939, the university goes to the Daughters of the American Revolution, Daughters of the American Revolution, a social political organization of women who date their lineage to people who fought in the American Revolution. So DAR, or the Daughters of the American Revolution, manage Constitution Hall, a large theater in Washington, D.C. But the problem is that the DAR is very white and very conservative in its politics. So in D.C. theaters, it was common for these theaters to have segregated audiences with black people relegated to the balcony. But DAR was different. It would not permit black people in the audience, period. It wouldn't even permit black people to perform on stage at Constitution Hall. Repeatedly rebuffed by white institutions, black leaders in D.C. formed the Marian Anderson Citizens Committee. The NAACP is involved, including a man named Charles Houston, a lawyer for the NAACP who teaches the first civil rights law classes in the country at Howard University. They turn this effort to find a venue for Marian Anderson to sing into a civil rights struggle as they challenge segregation in Washington, D.C. Ultimately, Charles Houston and the NAACP go to the White House for help. So note that it's important to know about Charles Houston, who dies at the age of 55, so he's relatively young. He was a civil rights lawyer who would play a big role not only in dismantling Jim Crow laws, but he also trained Thurgood Marshall, who directed the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund and would become the first Supreme Court justice. If you want to learn more about Charles Houston, you can watch the documentary called The Road to Brown. So civil rights activists do this. They go to the White House via McLeod Bethune to get an audience with the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. As a member of the DAR, Eleanor goes to the Daughters of the Revolution to get them to change their mind, but they refuse. And very publicly, the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, resigns from the Daughters of the American Revolution by publishing a column in the newspaper. Then Eleanor Roosevelt talks to Harold Ickes, who is white and is the Secretary of the Interior. Harold Ickes is considered a quote-unquote friend of the race, by civil rights leaders. He is also the previous leader of the NAACP chapter in Chicago. As Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes controls the National Mall, the area in front of the Lincoln Memorial, where the March on Washington happens in 1963 at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. He arranges for the concert to happen at the National Mall. And 75,000 people arrive at the mall, and they find something quite extraordinary when they arrive. There are no colored only or white only signs. The concert is integrated, and DC at the time was a heavily segregated city, so this is very unusual. So there's 75,000 people at the mall listening to Marian Anderson, but there are also untold thousands listening to the concert live over the radio. Harold Ickes gives the following speech as an introduction, which is short but powerful. He says, "Genius, like justice, is blind. For genius, with the tip of her wings, has touched this woman who, if it had not been for the great mind of Jefferson, if it had not been for the great heart of Lincoln, would not be able to stand among us today as a free individual in a free land. Genius draws no color line." So Marian Anderson, in a long fur coat, singing with just a piano accompanying her, steps up to the microphone, and in a powerful rebuke, she simply begins her concert by singing, "My country, 'tis of thee."
Nation's most impressive Easter demonstration. 75,000 massed before Lincoln Memorial to hear Marian Anderson, colored contralto, make her capital debut at the great Emancipator Shrine. Refusal of the DAR to let her use their hall and a countrywide controversy, with this great gathering as the climax. The singer was invited by Secretary of the Interior, Ickes, who attends with Secretary of the Treasury, Morgenthau. Spectators include Supreme Court Justice Black, New York Senator Robert Wagner, and a host of notables, here to listen to the voice acclaimed by many as the finest in a century.
So this is an important moment in the history of the civil rights movement for a couple of reasons. Number one, it suggests to African Americans that the federal government at the highest levels really does care. And this is another reason that they start to vote for the Democrats, because first, FDR and now Eleanor Roosevelt and Harold Ickes are saying, quote, "Genius draws no color line." And second, it's also important because this concert is happening in the context of a larger battle against the rhetoric of the Nazi doctrines of racial superiority. So pointing to racism in the US, Hitler and the Nazis could say the US has no leg to stand on in its opposition to Nazism. So now I want to turn to World War II to provide some broad context before going more into African American history during World War II. So internationally, as the U.S. moved to the left politically in the context of the Great Depression, electing Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Germany moves to the right. So in Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power. They received support by scapegoating particular groups of people, of course, Jews, gay people, communists, the disabled, Roma, gypsies, and so on. Similar developments happened in Spain and Italy with the rise of fascism. And the definition of fascism is that it promotes extreme nationalism and authoritarianism. Like the Nazis, fascists often believed in conflict between the races, and fascists generally can't withstand dissent to the authority of the regime. So in Spain, you have the Francisco Franco becomes the dictator of Spain. In Italy, Benito Mussolini was a dictator from 1925 through the end of the Second World War, when he was assassinated by members of the resistance. You also have Japan in the 30s. Japan is trying to expand its military and economic power throughout Asia. It, for instance, invaded Manchuria in 1931. It invaded China 6 years later. And so together, these countries, most prominently Italy, Spain, Germany, and Japan, they form the Axis powers. And World War II starts in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. At the start of the war, the two primary opponents of the Axis powers were England and France. They're known as the Allied powers. In a couple of years, the Soviet Union and the United States would join the Allies to fight in the war against the Nazis and the fascists. So it was World War II that finally lifted the U.S. out of the Great Depression. This was due to an increase in production and the growth of factories, planes, cars, tanks, munitions, and so on, which put more people back to work and brought more money into the U.S. economy. So while the U.S. was benefiting financially from the war, it didn't actually enter the war on the side of the Allies until something happened in December of 1941, 2 years after the start of the Second World War. And that, of course, was Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. When Japanese planes bombed the naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, 2,000 American servicemen were killed, 8 battleships were destroyed or damaged. And this sparked U.S. entry into the Second World War, which would last until the end, until August of 1945. So at this moment, I think it's important to acknowledge that the U.S.'s main reason for entering World War II was not necessarily to promote minority rights. It took a direct military assault on the United States by Japan for the U.S. to finally enter the war, to trigger U.S. entry into the war. It's also important to note that the U.S. itself has a long history of anti-Semitism, and it did not allow many Jewish refugees to enter the United States who were fleeing Nazi death camps over the course of World War II. So if the U.S. was fighting Nazism abroad, an ideology first and foremost about racial superiority, shouldn't African Americans be given rights at home? There are a couple of main ways that African Americans are being disadvantaged during the war. First, in the military. During the war, black soldiers served in segregated units in the Army, and there were only 5 black officers in the entire military. So the Marine Corps and the Air Corps barred blacks completely, while the Department of the Navy and Coast Guard accepted them only as messmen and as laborers. You've already learned about the Port Chicago disaster of 1944, but I'll just remind you, this is when black men enlisted in the Navy were put to work loading and unloading munitions just north of San Francisco, when an explosion in which 320 people were killed, 202 of them were African American. So this explosion happens and 320 people are killed, but 202 of them are African American. And when black men were told to return to work a month later, 258 refused to follow orders, demanding that safety on the job be enhanced beforehand. And because of this, 208 men were court-martialed, 50 were charged with mutiny, and sentenced to 8 to 15 years hard labor. There was also discrimination that extended to the blood banks. African Americans could not give blood to white soldiers during World War I. Despite this, black soldiers served with distinction during the war. Ultimately, 1 million served. For the first time, for example, 600 black men served as military pilots during wartime. They were popularly known as the Tuskegee Airmen. So the second way that African Americans are experiencing the war is discrimination in war production and in factories. So production during the war lifted the U.S. out of the Great Depression, as I said, but black people were having a difficult time gaining access to jobs, including better paying jobs within the factories. Because of discrimination, African Americans are being hired to do things like push a broom rather than the more higher paying, highly paid jobs like rolling steel. So enter A. Philip Randolph, who we've talked a little bit about before in the class. He is one of the most important transitional figures in African American history. And I think a little biography will lend some insight into his background. So he's born in Florida in 1889, and like so many other civil rights leaders, he'll leave the South for the North in 1911. He's born in 1889 and dies in 1979 at the age of 90 years old. In his lifetime, he's involved in almost every single civil rights struggle. And he also, of course, sees tremendous political change in his lifetime. He's a young man when Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois are debating each other. In the 1930s and 1940s, he's essentially the main leader of the civil rights movement, as we'll soon see. And he's on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 when Martin Luther King Jr. gives his I Have a Dream speech. So what makes his politics distinct when compared to people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington? So he's to the left of both for much of his life. Randolph's major contribution is that he's concerned with black workers, so the black working class. He's asking where is the political space for black workers to become active and to attain their rights. The NAACP and other organizations are quite top-down and tend to attract middle-class support and not prioritize black workers. So it's his concern with black workers who are being exploited and living in poverty that leads him to turn toward socialist politics in 1917, the same year as the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. With Chandler Owen, he founds the black socialist paper, The Messenger, with actually the help of his wife, who owns a salon. So she provides him with the money that he needs to found The Messenger. In his search to involve black workers, though, he decides to form a union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, becoming the union's president in 1925. So what is a union? At its most basic level, it's a democratic organization that negotiates with employers on behalf of workers around bread and butter issues, things like wages, health benefits, job safety, and job security. But it's also an organization that has the potential, through its membership and financial resources from members' union dues, to fight for social and economic justice on a larger scale. For instance, countries that provide health care for all often do so because the labor movement demanded it. So rather than only demanding health care for the workers at a specific workplace, labor unions can use their power, their money, their influence to demand broader social reforms. So for black workers specifically, the union is an organization that has the capacity, through the collective strength of the workers themselves, to combat racial discrimination. And A. Philip Randolph firmly believes that black workers, to strengthen their rights on the job and to combat discrimination at work and in society more generally, must be a part of labor unions. The problem is, though, that the American Federation of Labor, or I should say the American labor movement, has a mixed and in many ways very poor record about including black workers. But in the 1930s, we start to see this change, and for the first time, black workers really unionizing in large numbers. In the 1920s, the American Federation of Labor included about 80% of the labor movement, and most unions affiliated with the AFL did not accept black workers. So the American Federation of Labor in the 20s is the major labor federation, and it, by and large, did not accept black workers. And the AFL presidents refused to intercede to force local unions to include black workers. Due to pressure by black workers and A. Philip Randolph, the AFL begins to change its tune in the 1930s, though it still has a lot of work to do moving forward. So as part of the New Deal, and in the context of a massive strike wave in 1935, the Franklin Roosevelt administration signed the law, the Wagner Act, signs the Wagner Act into law in 1935, which for the first time grants workers the legal right to organize unions and provides some mechanism to enforce this legal right. So this triggers a massive wave of labor activism. The labor movement is the major social movement of the 1930s. So this is when we see, it's in the 1930s that we see the birth of the modern labor movement. So in the 1930s, we also see the establishment of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO, which organizes workers and industry and is much more inclusive of black workers, in large part because of the involvement of the Communist Party. So for black workers to unionize, they have to fight two battles, and these are the two key points to remember. They have to fight their bosses, of course, to unionize, to demand improved conditions on the job, but they also have to fight the white leadership in some of these unions, particularly in the AFL. After years of struggle, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters becomes a part of the American Federation of Labor, and ultimately, in 1939, is recognized as the union for black sleeping car porters. So what do sleeping car porters do? They provide service on Pullman sleeping cars. The Pullman porter greeted passengers, carried baggage, made beds, tidied cars, served food and drinks, and had to be available night and day to wait on passengers. And the workforce consists almost entirely of black men. Prior to the union, the workers were paid low wages. With the union, they win improved wages, benefits, and job security. Now, because of the union, becoming a Pullman porter is one of the three main avenues by which black men, in particular, can access or achieve middle-class status in the 20th century, with the other two mainly being the military and the post office. So A. Philip Randolph in 1939 is without a doubt not only the single most important black labor leader in the country, but he's also emerging as the most important civil rights leader. The union also becomes actively involved in the civil rights movement. A. Philip Randolph and others go directly to the White House to make demands in 1941, right before the U.S. enters World War I. They call for, first, the integration of the military, and second, access to well-paying jobs in the defense factories, an end to racial discrimination in industry. But this plea initially is ignored because Franklin Roosevelt is afraid of losing the support of white supremacists in the Democratic Party coalition. So A. Philip Randolph ups the ante. He initially calls for 10,000 people to march on Washington to achieve these demands. Then he calls for 50,000. Then he calls for 100,000 people. And all of this doesn't seem like a bluff. His movement is gaining traction, and he's using his powerful position within the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters to his advantage. So Franklin D. Roosevelt invites Randolph to the White House for a meeting. And the result is that Roosevelt strikes a compromise with Randolph. In exchange for calling off this march on Washington, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802. It says there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin, and that it's the duty of the employers and labor organizations to provide for the full and equitable participation of all workers in defense industries without discrimination based on race, creed, color, or national origin. So it also sets up a Fair Employment Practices Commission that would be a watchdog organization. But Roosevelt does not agree to desegregate the military. This will have to wait. But despite this, this is, I think, a significant moment in this history of the long civil rights movement. The major leader of the civil rights movement sits down with the president, negotiates with him, and comes to a resolution. So this sends a message that there is a social movement afoot and that change is possible. And from this moment on, future presidents simply cannot afford to ignore African American demands for change, and as they've been doing essentially since the country's founding. So to conclude, Franklin Roosevelt dies in 1945 before the end of the war. His vice president, Harry Truman, becomes president, and he makes a decision to drop an atomic bomb on Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, ultimately with as many as 350,000 people, mostly civilians, being killed by 1950 from the immediate effects of the bombing and then radiation poisoning and cancer in the following years. A. Philip Randolph and other civil rights leaders, such as Bayard Rustin, a man we'll come back to in future lessons, continued to make demands on Harry Truman to desegregate the military. In the late 1940s, A. Philip Randolph and others picketed in front of the White House. They showed up at the Democratic National Convention, and because the Democratic Party was increasingly dependent on the black vote, ultimately Truman bows to pressure, and in 1948, he signed Executive Order 9981, which called for an end to segregation in the armed forces. And by the end of the war, it's a devastating war. 12 million people are exterminated by the Nazis, including 6 million Jews and millions of gay people, disabled people, communists, and Roma people. And though the Soviet Union bore the brunt of the fighting, with nearly 27 million soldiers and civilians dying over the course of the war, 450,000 Americans lost their lives fighting in World War II. And you can see that the war also has a big influence on future civil rights struggles into the 1950s and 1960s.